Okay, chapter 4.4, finding the percent of a number. There's a couple of key things here we're going to talk about. We'll practice a little bit. This word right here is possibly the most important one. Whenever we say the word of in mathematics, usually we mean to multiply. So whenever they say a percent of a number, it usually means a percent times a number. And that's basically how that works. We've talked about that with fractions already. Like for instance, half of 4. You guys know that half of 4 is equal to 2. But if you multiply half times 4, you rewrite it like this, and you get 4 halves, which can be simplified down to 2. You can see that it works here. Okay, of means times, means to multiply. All right, and so when we get a percent of a number, there's basically two tricks. For instance, if they give us 20% of 60, so say that we're going to buy a new pair of shoes, and the shoes are $60, but they say you can take 20% off, and we want to find out how much money we can subtract from that $60. We might say, what's 20% of 60? And we write 20% either as a fraction or as a decimal. So, and we change the of to times. So method 1 would be using a fraction, maybe, and method 2 might be using a decimal, and we'll see what happens with both. Using a fraction, that's like 20% is 20 over 100 times 60 over 1. Okay, so if you were to do 20 times 60 straight off, you would get 1,200 over 100. And if you want to divide by 100, basically you're just canceling these, you're moving it over 2 decimal places. When you divide by 100, the decimal comes over twice, or you can just cancel zeros. Okay, so the decimal would go in here, so it would really be 12, or 12.0. So 20% of 60 is 12. So if we had $60 shoes and we knew we were going to save 20%, we could subtract $12 from 60 and get like $48 would be our new total, and that kind of makes sense. Most of you can do 10% in your head, so if we just take a look at this just to kind of check our work, what's 10% of 60? Well, 10% of 60 is $6, so that's something that we kind of just know how to do. We sort of automatically do that. So 20% of 60 would just be twice as much. So it would be $12, and we can see that that kind of matches. 10% of 60 is 6, so 20% is twice that much. It's 12. And we can see that that works. A great way to check. It's actually a great way to do percentages. If you can find a way to do it using tens or multiples of tens or even half of 10, you can figure out all kinds of ways to do percentages of things just by knowing how to do 10%. Knowing that 50% is half is another cool thing. So like if we said 50% of 60, 50% is, of 60, 50% is 50 over 100. But that could also be written down as 1/2. Okay, so 50% is 1/2. And we know what half of 60 is. Half of 60 is 30. Okay, so half of 60, let's get rid of that, it doesn't make sense. Well, I got a little too much scribbling going on here, but I think you guys get the idea. 50% of something is half of something. Half of 60 is that right there. Okay, so let's look at method number 2. We're going to use the same numbers. We already know it's 12, but 20% of 60 gets us $12. But if we use a decimal, okay, so 20% is the same as 0.2 of 60. Now this one means you have to actually multiply. Of means times, and 0.2 of 60 excuse me, there we go. It'd be like 60 times 0.2. But you guys all know that when you multiply using a decimal, you just take the decimal out and you multiply without the decimal, and then you put the decimal back in. So we're going to go 60 times 2. And that's something we can do in our head. And then we have to put that one decimal place back in, and so we get 12, right? Putting the decimal place back in gets us 60 times 0.2 equals 12.0. Okay, so 12.0 is just 12. So we knew it was 12 all along. And so using a decimal to multiply works pretty well too. Okay. Now, one other real quick thing to show you, using the same numbers, 20% of 60. If you do use 20 out of 100 as a fraction, you actually could simplify that down to, say, 2 out of 10. That's the same as 20 out of 100, or even 1 out of 5, if you wanted to, right? So 1/5 times 60, well, let's write that down here. 1/5 times 60, okay, is just 60 over 5, and then you'd have to say, well, how many times does 5 go into 60? Well, 5 times 12 is 60. So again, we get 12, and it doesn't matter how we do it. We get the same answer, and it's neat to know that there are so many pathways to the answer, whether we use 20 out of 100 or 1 out of 5 or 10 out of 50. 10 out of 50 times 60 is going to give us the same thing. We end up with 12. Whether we write it as a decimal and go 0.2 times 60, we still get the same thing. And there's multiple ways to do it. Some ways are definitely easier. They give you a number. This is a different one. Say 25% times 40. 25% of, that's what I should say, although we need to know that that's times. 25% of 40. Now, some of us know right away that 25% is 25 hundredths, which is the same as 1/4. Okay, it simplifies down to 1/4. And we see this 25%, it's possible to jump right to the fraction 1/4. And we can think 1/4 of 40 is equal to 40/4. And that's, 10, right? Because 4 times 10 is 40. That simplifies right down to 10. We can see it happen. We can actually do it kind of in our head, do it quickly. And we've got all kinds of ways where it's nice to do this, but sometimes it gets a little more complicated. They give us harder ones. For instance, they may give us something like 150. Well, let me get a new page, a new color. 150%. Now this is a little harder because this is more than 100 times 120. Okay, or of. Okay, of. We always need to remember that of means times, and they're probably going to give us a lot of these of questions. Now, 150% can be written as 150 over 100, because all percents are over 100, times 120. And then, we could simplify before we multiply. We could say that 150 over 100 is like 15 over 10, and we can simplify diagonal here and say that that's like, so then really it's like 15 times 12 over 1. And then I just have to figure out what 15 times 12 is, because I've canceled out all my zeros. And this is one way. This might be a fine way to do it. You could also simplify right away 150 over 100 down to 15 over 10, and then simplify that a little farther by dividing by 5, which is 3 over 2. So 3 halves is the same as 150%. So 3 halves times 120. Okay, and then we can, multiply and simplify so that 120 halves becomes 60 wholes, and then we just do 3 times 60 is 180 over 1 times 1 is 1, so 180. So here's an interesting thing I want you to see. my answer is 180, and you might say, well, I started with 150 and I got 120. 150 times 120, how did it go up? Well, 100% is like one whole. 100% times 120 would be 120. And since this is more than 100%, our answer is actually going to grow. Okay, whenever you multiply by a percentage bigger than 100, it gets bigger. Like 200% is actually twice as much as something. Let me show you real quick. If we did 200%, well, let me show you 100%. 100% of 5 is equal to 100 over 100 times 5. And isn't 100 over 100 just 1? So it's going to be the same as itself. Okay, so 100% of 5 is 5. That's all of it. But 200% of 5 is going to be twice as much as 5. So you're going to have 200 over 100 times 5, which 200 over 100 is really 2 over 1 times 5, which is just 10 over 1, which is just 10. So you started with 5 and now you have twice as much. When you have 200% of a number, it grows, you get twice as much. So we're seeing all these cool things happen. But what if we went ahead and we did that 150% of 120 and we just use a decimal? I don't know if that's going to work or not. I mean, I know it's going to work, but I don't know if it's easier. They like us to use decimals. Do you remember how to change 150% into a decimal? Remember, you just move the decimal place over twice. This is from a recent lesson. Okay, change it from a decimal from a percent into a decimal. It's just 1.5. We move the decimal over twice times 120. And so if you just write it out like this, and imagine that there's no decimal. 5 times 5 is 25. 10, 11, 12. 5 times 5 plus 1 is 6. Start with your placeholder. 0, 1 times 5, 1 times 1. Add everything all up. Well, that's really strange because I said 150% of 120, but then I wrote 125, and I start getting weird things here. That's not correct. Let's try that again with 120 and see what we get. I know we did this on the other page and we got 180. 775 doesn't make any sense. So I did something weird there. I'm not even going to worry about it. And you might have noticed what I did wrong, but we're just going to go through here a little more carefully, possibly. With this one, 5 times 0. 5 times 2 is 10. 5 times 1 plus 1 is 6. And then add my 0 placeholder. You have 0, 1 times 2, 1 times 1. Oh, yeah, see, I missed that whole digit here. 5 times, yeah, anyway. If you saw that, you got to figure it out. So I have 600 plus 1200, which is this right here. And then it equals, believe it or not, 1800. But then I have to put my decimal back in. So it's 180.0. So 180 is still what I get, even if I use a decimal. Some of you would rather use the multiplication here. Believe it or not, I prefer the fraction method almost every time, and I love fractions. And some of you do not like fractions, and that might be why. Okay. Another way to do this, and the book is pretty good at showing you this. They say 150% of 120. Okay, they say, well, why don't you split it up? Why don't you split it up into 100%? This way you can do it in your head. 100% of 120. So this is our question, but we're going to split 150% into 100 and then 50. So we've got two problems now, but both of them are easy. Okay, 100% of 120 is just 120. We've already seen what happens when we use 100%. So 100% of 120 is 120. And 50% of 120, well, we know that 50%, we already talked about this, is the same as 1/2. And 1/2 of 20 is equal to 60. And then if we add these two numbers up, we just add these two numbers, we get 180, which we already knew was the answer. So you can kind of, you can do this a whole bunch of ways if it starts to be easy for you, or if it makes sense to you, that you start to realize there's a bunch of different ways to do this. Splitting numbers up, using decimals, simplify before you multiply. There's another example that they put in the book, 80% of 15, okay? And they wrote down 80% as 80 over 100, but they simplified it as quickly as they could. And let's see, what we can divide 80 by 10 and 100 by 10 to get 8 over 10, and that simplifies down to 4 over 5. So once we figure out that 80% is 4/5, we can redo this as 4/5 times 15. And you remember from simplify before you multiply that 15/5 can be written as 3 ones. 15 divided by 5 is 3, and 5 divided by 5 is 1. And then you just multiply and get 12 ones. So it's 12. So 15% of 80 is 12. And that kind of makes sense because 10% of 80 is 8. This is where I like to use my 10%. 10% of 80 is 8. And we're looking for 15%. So we go 5% of 80. Well, 10% is 8, so 5% is half of that, so it has to be 4. And 8 plus 4 equals 12. So again, 15% is quickly done by splitting it up into 10% and 5%. All right, I might have confused a couple of you. If you have to watch the video more than once, do so, because this is a super cool concept. It's something that you actually will use in real life all the time. And it's a good way to do math using fractions. Using decimals if you have to. Decimals is a simpler way, like you don't have to learn as much, but it's not actually as cool and it doesn't work as well. The fractions is my favorite, and it's better. It's something that if you get good at, you'll use for your whole life. Okay, that's the end.